If you were a witness to a car crash, you would probably swear under oath about, the color of the vehicle that ran the red light.
Right, you'd be absolutely certain.
Exactly, you'd be totally certain. But what if I told you the justice system is built on this biological machine that is so incredibly flawed, it will routinely overwrite your memory just because a lawyer used the word smash instead of bump?
Oh, yeah, it happens all the time.
I mean, usually when we talk about complex machines like, I don't know, a Swiss watch or a computer processor, there's this expectation of perfect binary precision, right? It either works or it's broken.
Right.
But when you look at the most complex machine on the planet, the human mind, that expectation of precision just completely flies out the window. We are looking at an apparatus that is incredibly, surprisingly murky.
Well, and that murkiness isn't a glitch. It is actually the core feature of the system.
Mhm.
I mean, we tend to view our cognitive blind spots as these embarrassing failures of logic, but from a biological standpoint, they are highly specialized survival tools.
Welcome to this deep dive. Today, we are exploring the fascinating flawed machinery of your mind. We are unpacking how you make decisions, why your reasoning gets hijacked, and specifically, the incredibly complex ways your mind forgets and reconstructs information.
There is a lot to cover today.
Oh, definitely. We have a massive stack of sources today. We're pulling from Daniel Schachter's foundational work on the seven sins of memory, Cass Sunstein's research on institutional sludge, deep dives into cognitive biases in UX design, and highly ambiguous political debates. And we even have a statistical debunking of the famous Dunning-Kruger effect.
Which is going to surprise a lot of people, I think.
For sure. Our mission today is to give you a shortcut to understanding your own mind's architecture, why these supposed errors happen, and why your faulty memory is actually a hidden evolutionary superpower. Okay, let's unpack this. Before we get into the heavy stuff about how we selectively remember the past, we need to establish how the brain actually processes the world in real time.
Right, and to map that out, cognitive scientists use something called cognitive bias codex. It takes over 180 documented cognitive biases and groups them into four fundamental information processing conundrums. And these are things that you and I face every single second of the day.
Over 180. That's wild. So what are the four conundrums?
So the brain has to navigate information overload, a lack of meaning, the need to act fast, and finally, figuring out what is actually worth remembering. And since you and our listeners likely already know what biases like confirmation bias or hindsight bias are on a surface level, the more interesting question is why they exist at all.
Right. Why do we have them?
They're heuristics, basically mental shortcuts designed to prevent complete cognitive paralysis.
Because if you had to consciously process every single photon of light, every background noise, and every physical sensation hitting your nervous system right now.
Oh, your brain would just completely lock up.
Exactly. So the brain is essentially acting like an aggressively overtuned email spam filter, right? It's deleting massive amounts of sensory noise just to survive the sheer volume of daily input, even if it, occasionally trashes an important message.
That spam filter analogy works perfectly for those real-time processing conundrums. The brain is just constantly triaging. We filter out data that contradicts our pre-existing beliefs because updating our entire worldview requires way too much metabolic energy.
It's just too exhausting.
Exactly. And we rely on the first piece of information we hear, which is anchoring, because searching for a second or third data point takes time we might not have in a survival situation.
Right, like if you're running from a bear, you don't have time to double check your sources.
Right. But the problem arises because we no longer live in an environment where these fast, energy-saving judgments are strictly about avoiding predators. We live in these complex, bureaucratic societies that know exactly how to exploit those exact same biological triage mechanisms.
Yeah, that weaponization of our mental shortcuts. That brings us to Cass Sunstein's concept of sludge from the sources. We see this heavily in the conundrum of needing to act fast.
We really do.
Sunstein points out that in a single year, the United States government imposed 9.78 billion hours of paperwork burden on its citizens.
Billion, with a B.
With a B. But that friction isn't just bureaucratic incompetence. The private sector uses the exact same mechanics through dark patterns in user experience design. Like, they will bury a data sharing opt-out button at the bottom of a labyrinthine privacy policy while making the accept all button this bright blue frictionless target. They're actively exploiting status quo bias and action bias.
Because they understand the math of human inertia. Because your brain is designed to conserve energy, overcoming the default setting requires a massive spike in cognitive effort. Sludge is simply the monetization of that biological reluctance.
Wow. The monetization of biological reluctance. That's a great way to put it.
But, friction and sludge only really work when the path forward is somewhat clear. When we transition to the second conundrum, which is the lack of meaning, the mechanics of bias change completely.
Oh, so?
Well, if I ask you, what is 2 plus 2? Your political views, your identity, or how tired you are, they don't matter. Reality provides a strict, fast correction.
It's just 4.
Right. But when evidence is highly ambiguous, biases just rush in to fill the vacuum.
Yeah, the sources bring up the modern immigration debate to illustrate this impartially, and it is such a fascinating case study in cognitive mechanics. Both sides of the political spectrum fall prey to the exact same mental architecture because the data is incredibly dense and multifaceted.
Exactly.
The supporter of strict border enforcement isn't just arriving at a conclusion objectively. Their brain might be leaning on status quo bias, which, naturally prefers familiar social structures. Or they might focus intensely on high-profile, vivid news stories about crime due to availability bias.
Right, because the brain latches on to that singular, terrifying narrative.
Wow.
A vivid threat feels much more real and actionable than some spreadsheet of aggregate crime statistics.
Right. It feels more urgent.
What's fascinating here is that intelligence doesn't actually immunize you against this process.
Wait, really?
Yeah, the sources highlight that the smarter you are, the better you become at rationalizing your preferred conclusion.
Oh, wow.
And on the flip side of that same debate, an opponent of strict enforcement is driven by the exact same need to simplify ambiguous data. They might be influenced by the identifiable victim effect.
Right, because the human brain is evolutionarily wired to feel deep, actionable empathy for a single story of hardship, like a face, a name.
Exactly. While it completely fails to process the abstract suffering or logistical impacts of a million people, or they might fall for the halo effect, focusing heavily on highly successful immigrant entrepreneurs and unconsciously mapping that positive trait onto a massive, diverse population.
Because complex values like national security versus humanitarianism, they just have no objective 2 plus 2 answer. So the brain just builds a narrative out of whatever emotional salience is lying around.
We basically operate like lawyers defending a client we've already decided is innocent, rather than scientists testing a hypothesis.
That is so true. And speaking of testing hypotheses, the sources completely dismantle how we view our own competence when data is ambiguous, specifically regarding the Dunning-Kruger effect.
Oh, this is one of my favorite parts. The Dunning-Kruger effect is arguably the most famous psychological phenomenon on the internet right now. The premise is that people with low ability wildly overestimate their competence, while true experts underestimate themselves.
Right. We've culturally accepted this as this deep psychological flaw about human hubris. Like, stupid people are too stupid to know they're stupid.
Right, exactly. But new research by Magnus and Peresetsky suggests it might not be a psychological bias at all.
It's a statistical artifact. I love this part of the reading because it's just pure math.
Yeah.
If you give a group of people a test and someone scores in the absolute bottom percentile, let's say they get a 10%, and you ask them to guess their score, they literally cannot underestimate their performance.
Exactly. The boundary constraint of the test means any random guess they make is mathematically forced to be higher than their actual score.
And conversely, if you score a 99%, any random noise in your self-assessment forces you to guess lower. The researchers propose we aren't inherently overly confident fools. We are just seeing random statistical noise hitting a floor and a ceiling.
It forces us to question how much of our perceived psychological dysfunction is just the architecture of the environment we are measuring it in, which is actually the perfect transition to the absolute core focus of today's analysis.
Right.
If our real-time processing is this heavily filtered, this easily bogged down by sludge, and this prone to misinterpreting ambiguous data to conserve energy, how does the brain handle the information it actually tries to save for later?
This brings us to Harvard psychologist Daniel Schachter's 7 Sins of Memory.
Yeah.
If we're going to understand the flawed machinery of the mind, we have to look intimately at how we forget. Schachter splits these 7 sins into 2 distinct camps.
Right, starting with the first camp.
Yeah, the 3 sins of omission. These are the mechanisms of outright loss. And the first sin is transience, which is the decaying of memory over time. But the sources show that this decay is far more aggressive and dramatic than we intuitively believe.
Yeah, it's wild. The O.J. Simpson trial verdict study from the sources is a perfect demonstration of transience. Researchers interviewed a group of undergraduates immediately after the verdict was announced in 1995.
Like right after.
Right after. They asked them highly specific questions about where they were, who they were with, and how they felt. The emotional salience of the event was incredibly high. Then, they brought those exact same students back 3 years later and asked them the exact same questions.
And what happened?
After just 3 years, fewer than 30% of the participants remembered their own experience accurately.
Less than 30%.
And more importantly, nearly half of them had major fundamental errors in their recollection, yet they were supremely confident in their false memories.
That is deeply unsettling. Almost half of the people were basically hallucinating a past that never happened, as 3 years removed from a major cultural event.
Yeah.
Which leads us to the second sin of omission, absent-mindedness. Now, I tend to think of forgetting like losing a file in a cabinet, but looking at the mechanics here, absent-mindedness isn't a failure to retrieve a file. It's more like trying to save a document on your computer, but you never actually gave the file a name or put it in a folder, and then you're surprised you can't find it later.
That is a much more accurate biological metaphor. Absent-mindedness is a failure at the interface of attention and memory. You didn't forget where you put your keys. You never actually allocated the cognitive resources to encode their location in the first place.
Like leaving the lens cap on a camera.
Exactly. The camera fired, the shutter clicked, but no light was ever exposed to the film. And the reason we do this is because our capacity to actively encode information is startlingly small. The sources reference cognitive psychologist George Miller's famous magic number 7.
Right. The idea that our short-term working memory can only juggle about 7 items of information at a time, plus or minus 2.
Correct. Working memory is a massive bottleneck. If you try to hold 9 or 10 disparate pieces of information in your mind, they just bounce off the system. The only way around it is a mechanism called chunking, where your brain groups smaller data points into larger, meaningful patterns.
Right, like remembering a phone number in grooves instead of individual digits.
Exactly. But if you aren't actively chunking or rehearsing the data, the limited slots in your working memory fill up instantly. You're holding those 7 items, someone asks you a question that breaks your attention, and the unencoded information simply vanishes.
The lens cap was on. And then we have the third sin of omission, which is blocking. This is that uniquely agonizing tip of the tongue phenomena.
Oh, I hate that feeling.
It's the worst. Unlike absent-mindedness, the memory was successfully encoded. The photograph was taken and developed, but you can't access it because another memory is actively interfering with the retrieval pathway. Your brain keeps fetching the wrong word, and that incorrect retrieval temporarily blocks the chemical pathway to the correct one.
So those are the 3 sins of omission: transience, absent-mindedness, and blocking. The information is either decayed, never encoded, or temporarily inaccessible.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. Losing access to a memory is one thing. But what happens when the memory doesn't fade, but instead actively rewrites itself without us ever knowing? This is Schachter's second camp, the 4 sins of commission. The memory is present, but it is fundamentally distorted.
And to understand the sins of commission, we have to throw away the idea that memory is a video recording. It isn't. Memory is more like a recipe.
A recipe?
Yeah, every single time you remember an event, your brain has to pull all the disparate ingredients, the sights, the sounds, the emotions from different parts of your cortex and rebake the cake from scratch.
Rebake the cake.
Wow. And because it is a reconstructive process, it is highly vulnerable to contamination.
Which perfectly explains the 4th sin, misattribution. This is source confusion. You have the correct ingredients, but you assign them to the wrong origin. Like, you remember a vivid story from a family vacation, and years later you realize you weren't even on that trip.
Right, you just heard your older sibling tell the story so many times that your brain basically stole the copyright and baked it into your own autobiographical memory.
That reconstructive vulnerability leads directly to the 5th sin, suggestibility. This is where external information, provided after the fact, gets woven into the memory during that rebaking process. And the sources highlight the groundbreaking work of psychologist Elizabeth Loftus, which has, massive implications for the legal system.
It really does. Her car crash study is the exact example you mentioned at the start of the show.
Right. A witness sees a minor traffic accident. Later, a researcher asks them a leading question. Did you see the blue car run the red light and hit the green car? But in reality, the car that ran the light was yellow.
Right.
But simply because an authority figure introduced the concept of a blue car, the witness's brain incorporates that vocabulary into the reconstruction. Weeks later, on the witness stand, they will confidently swear under oath that they saw a blue car. They aren't committing perjury. Their brain literally overwrote the ingredients of the memory based on a suggestion.
It reveals a profound fragility in eyewitness testimony. Our memories are constantly being updated by new information, which brings us to the sixth sin, bias. Just as external suggestions can rewrite the past, your internal state in the present heavily distorts how you reconstruct history.
The sources call this rosy retrospection. If you are in a great mood today, you'll look back on your childhood and literally remember it being happier than it actually was.
Yeah, we also suffer from self-consistency bias, where we unconsciously rewrite our past political or social views to match our current ones. It creates this false narrative that we have always been consistent and correct.
Wait, we literally edit our own history to protect our current ego.
We do, all the time. And finally, the seventh sin is persistence. This is the one sin where the central problem is an inability to forget.
Oh, this is the dark one.
Yeah, these are intrusive memories that loop endlessly. In its most severe clinical form, persistence is the biological mechanism underlying post-traumatic stress disorder. The emotional salience of the event is so terrifyingly high that the brain refuses to allow the memory to undergo normal transience or decay.
Okay, I have to push back here on behalf of everyone listening. We've just walked through an incredibly grim list. Our brains aggressively filter reality. They're easily manipulated by bureaucratic sludge. They warp ambiguous data to fit our biases. And our memory is a fragile, easily manipulated recipe that deletes things constantly and rewrites the rest.
It sounds pretty bad.
It sounds terrible. Why should you, the listener, care that your brain is a faulty, highly biased, memory-deleting machine? Honestly, this makes human cognition sound like a tragic, embarrassing design flaw.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we find that what looks like a design flaw is actually a highly sophisticated evolutionary feature. Let's look at the table concept from the sources. If I ask you to recall a memory involving a table, maybe a conversation you had at dinner last night, your brain brings it up almost instantly.
Right, I'm picturing my dining room table right now.
But imagine if your brain didn't suffer from transience. Imagine if you had a perfect, infallible memory that never decayed. When I said the word table, your brain wouldn't just bring up last night's dinner. It would instantly retrieve every single table you have ever seen in your entire life.
Oh my God.
Every desk, every coffee table, every picnic table from childhood, you would be completely paralyzed by a massive, unnavigable wave of data.
A literal tidal wave of useless wooden furniture drowning out my ability to answer a simple question.
Precisely why forgetting is an evolutionary imperative. Transience is what saves you. The decay of memory over time prevents cognitive clutter. By actively discarding specific, irrelevant details, your brain creates the space to form general concepts. It allows you to understand the abstract idea of a table without being rigidly chained to the hyperspecific details of every table that has ever existed.
Our aggressive spam filter isn't broken, it's just doing its job.
Exactly.
Because if it wasn't mercilessly deleting the noise, our cognitive inbox would explode and the whole biological server would crash. Memory is reconstructive because being able to mix and match past ingredients is what allows us to imagine the future and adapt to new situations.
Recognizing these biases and these memory sins doesn't cure us of them, but it provides a crucial layer of metacognition. When you read a polarizing news story that makes your blood boil, you now have the tools to pause and ask, am I judging this based on the identifiable victim effect? Is my brain just trying to conserve energy? You learn to navigate a complex world by acknowledging the reconstructive nature of your own mind.
We have covered some serious ground today. We started by mapping the cognitive triage of our real-time processing. We navigated the weaponized institutional sludge of paperwork and dark patterns. And we waded through the heavily biased, ambiguous waters of political debates.
It's been a journey.
And most importantly, we unpacked Daniel Schachter's 7 sins of memory. From the deleted files of transience to the corrupted recipes of suggestibility, only to discover that our flaws, our biases, and our tendency to forget are the exact survival mechanisms that keep us functional. So, what does this all mean?
It means we are beautifully imperfect, and the sooner we accept the biological reality of our blind spots, the better we can construct systems and personal habits that account for them.
I'm going to leave you with a final thought to mull over. The sources mention a modern phenomenon called the Google effect. This is our increasing tendency to forget information simply because we know we can easily search for it online. We are actively outsourcing our factual memory to our devices to avoid the frustration of Schachter's sins of forgetting. But if transience, the biological act of forgetting, is exactly what allows our brains to filter out the clutter, generalize concepts, and build deep wisdom, Are we unintentionally stripping our brains of their evolutionary superpower? If we possess a perfect outsourced digital memory in our pockets, does that mean we are slowly trading human wisdom for mere data storage? It's definitely something to think about the next time you reach for your phone, instead of searching the murky depths of your own mind. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the architecture of human error. Until next time.